Dean MacPherson opened charges against the suspended Independent Development Trust CEO Tebogo Malaka and the company spokesperson Phasha Makgolane. Now, this follows a Daily Maverick report that one of its investigative journalists, Pieter-Louis Myburgh, was offered 60,000 rand in cash in a bribery attempt in order to squash negative reports against Malaka, who was facing disciplinary hearings for an irregular 800 million rand oxygen plant tender, which has since been cancelled. Now, to reflect on the state of journalism and ethics and also the credibility of public officials involved in alleged corruption, we joined virtually now by Tebogo Khaas, who's the founder and chairperson of Public Interest South Africa. Tebogo, good morning. Thanks so much for speaking to us here on Morning Live.
Good morning, and thank you for having me, Sakina.
So I think by this time, we've all seen the Daily Maverick's Pieter-Louis Myburgh's video go viral. And what this has done is that it has once again exposed how deep the rot of corruption goes in our country. But what were your main takeaways from this particular story this week?
Yeah, my first takeaway out of that is that we do have good men and good women out there still. Here I'm referring to within the media space, because to be able to refuse an inducement such as the one that was given to Pieter Myburgh. It is something that many people cannot do. And we obviously have to commend him for having the courage to say no to what was patently an inducement for him not to carry a story from his investigative work. And more secondly, my biggest takeaway is also how stupid could someone be to actually make such an offer to a journalist who's renowned, an investigative journalist who's renowned for his work, having written 2 books about big corruption scandals, and yet somebody thinks they can just be able to buy them over 60,000 rands. In fact, the amount itself does not matter, because we've seen people be bought or be bribed even for 200 rands or a couple of thousand rands. So the amount itself shouldn't be sniffed at. Those are the 2 things that actually that came out very prominently: the stupidity of the CEO, as well as the steadfastness of Peter insofar as refusing the kind of bribe that was given to him.
So, whether you call it stupidity or desperation, either way, the question is, for some people, and some of the comments this morning have also touched on this in response to our question of the day, where people have asked, is this, do you believe, an isolated incident of desperation, or is it actually a reflection of a systemic belief that journalists can be bought if the price is right?
No, absolutely, and let us also not make ourselves believe that it is only journalists who can be bought. Anybody else can be bought. I mean, there's a good saying that says everybody has a price. Not everybody will actually accede to any bribe or inducement or corrupt activity, but certainly it shows the desperation on the one part, because then I think if you hear from the conversation that the short conversation she had with Peter, she actually was pleading for sympathy and public sympathy, in fact, from sympathy from Peter himself. Using the fact that the parents are being hurt by these reports. So certainly it was a case of now showing that it is not the first instance where such money was, such inducement was made, and they came prepared. How they determine the amount of the bribe, it's something that only they themselves can learn. But you can see that they already knew that this is something that could easily be accepted or easily be done by within their course of doing business. And it is certainly, it gave the lens credence to some of the stories, including the construction mafias and all those other things, where people push brown envelopes to stake a claim in the public infrastructure construction, and so it is common cause that it is something that is prevalent, and I'm sure that whoever the hawks or whoever will be undertaking the investigation, they will make sure that they expand the network of the investigation.
How damaging is such an incident to already frail public trust in public officials?
It erodes it even much more so. Whatever little trust there still is, you would recall that not so long ago there was a report, I can't remember who actually commissioned that report, that shows that the public trust has actually eroded insofar as the public sector or officials are concerned. And to the extent that this actually even affects public infrastructure like the building of schools, clinics, and so forth, in a country that is in dire need of classrooms, in a country that is in dire need of more healthcare facilities. And yet you find that individuals such as it is alleged that the CEO of the IDT would rather, take the money to actually go and spend on their or sustain their ostentatious lifestyle, like big houses and travels and all the like. So it is something that seems to be very systemic, and it is something that we believe the timing is now. And I think we must commend also the minister for being very strong in actually, the actions that he has taken, and even for Peter himself. You recall that he was actually, there were fake accounts made, WhatsApp account made, whereupon information was sent through or was spread around to create an impression that he was was on to mischief, and yet he stood steadfast. And you would even recall, I'm sure you would recall, even comments from some of the celebrated media personalities, some of them actually even accusing him of stifling black excellence. Now, the funny thing is, now we've seen black excellence now wanting to counter-bribe the very same journalists whom they were alleging that he was out to get them, to get them.
And then, of course, there were so many conversations had all of this week since this particular incident surfaced. And many people also questioning, again, going back to that relationship between public officials and journalists who are there as another layer of oversight and very often, the eyes and ears of the public in this instance. So many people were talking about that brazen act and just how easy it was to put money on the table in the hopes that you would make the story go away. And the question is whether the reason why that was so easy and so brazen is because there may be a perception that this is what is routinely done. And then again, the question is around journalists and the trust that the public has in our journalists in South Africa. What's your take on that?
One has to be very mindful of the fact that journalists are human beings, and in their course of work, they also need to cultivate relationships, often with the subject of their stories. And the question is, at what point can the line be drawn? Because then if the lines are blurred from professional conduct or from professional relationship to one that is of fraternizing, and even you can easily get tempted to actually be blindfolded and wear rose-colored glasses when you actually ought not to be fraternizing with the subject of a story or those that we are covering. So the line can be very blurred at some point, and because of the proximity. And also there's also been accusation that in some instances, most journalists actually use journalism as a springboard to actually go into plum jobs into government and vice versa. But mainly it is the other, the former, which is where most journalists seem, in some instances, they actually prepare themselves to take up plush government positions. So it becomes difficult for somebody with that type of mindset to actually be firm and be able to say, look, I'll be professional in my conduct, and if it's investigative journalism, I will make sure that I don't cross the lines and make sure that I conduct myself in a manner that won't bring the profession under disrepute. But certainly, journalists investigative journalists in this country go through a lot, Sakina. They go through a lot, not only so much financial inducement. In some instances, if you don't take the money, you actually they might actually tell you there's a bullet waiting for you. We've seen it with investigative journalism with regards to whistleblowers themselves, whereupon if you look at instances like the Tembisa hospital, some of the journalists have been threatened with their lives, not so much money. I'm not sure if they were offered money, which I cannot exclude that, but the stories that we picked up was that they were actually threatened, living in fear for exposing that which we now know was happening in Tembisa and other places.
So how do you then insulate journalists against political and commercial pressures if very often those very publications or media entities are themselves tied to political power?
Yeah, look, at the end of the day, it boils down to an individual character themselves, because it doesn't matter how much sensitizing, how much lecturing one could do. I'm talking in terms of being able to create awareness for journalists, which I believe is probably happening. Well, obviously, I'm not a journalist myself, so I wouldn't know if there are any such intervention. But to insulate them, it is something that I would believe maybe media houses and even journalists themselves must actually take very seriously, and I'm sure there ought to be even refresher or interventions of some sort on ethical guidelines in terms of what it is that journalists need to be aware of, what it is that media houses need to be aware of. And yes, in many instances, you find that it is very difficult because media houses, especially now with the sprouting even of social media outlets, I'm not sure if we should call them journalists, but the dissemination of information the lines get to be blurred. If you look at the instance of Kenny Kunene not so long ago, whereupon he owned a media's platform as a politician, which he wanted to use to actually disseminate information that apparently, according to him and Gayton McKenzie, was to make sure that they create a good picture for the Patriotic Alliance, which they believe that was not being covered favorably by the rest of the media. So there is that element of journalists or journalism being seen as a way to be able to amplify or to be able to create influence in the media, in the public discourse, and therefore the ownership issue also is an issue. In fact, there are some media houses where you'd find that they wouldn't do certain stories because it might actually embarrass their owners. One wouldn't mention names, but it is something that is in there, and I think it is only independent journalists themselves whom we can rely on to say, irrespective of the pressure that I am within my employ, I'll be able to stand up to what I believe is in the public interest and that is right.
And of course, just finally, systemic reforms. How and what can we actually do in that regard to make sure that journalists are protected?
I wish I had an answer, but I would imagine that organizations such as SANEF itself ought to be able to bring this, under their scrutiny to see what it is that can be done to actually make sure that we insulate journalists from this type of potential, situations, and to make sure that there's ethical conduct throughout the way. We've heard of instances, it is not only the media house themselves, even the institutions within government. I mean, crime intelligence being one of those instances where we've had reports in the past, especially going back to the Zondo Commission, where certain journalists were actually seen to be benefited from the slush fund. So it is also incumbent on even the institutions themselves to sensitize officials not to try and even induce journalists.
Well, thank you so much. Tebogo Khaas, founder and chairperson of Public Interest South Africa, talking to us about bribery and ethical state of journalism in South Africa. And just a reminder, our question of the day also speaks to this particular matter. And this is what we're asking you this morning. What do you make of the recent attempts by the IDT's suspended Chief Executive Officer, Tebogo Malaka, to allegedly bribe a journalist to squash the investigation and influence the reporting of that story? Let us know your thoughts at Morning Live SABC 0784591897 for your voice notes.